Such a pleasure to be here. So I'm a psychologist. I study decision making. And if you know anything about psychology, you know that most of us use highly controlled experimental studies. So we get people in a lab, we give them, let's say, choices like choices between gambles. That's what I do for most of my career. Or maybe choices between scenarios described in vignettes. And based on this, we make some inferences about their underlying mental processes. Now, this approach is very useful. It's led to the development of many good theories of psychological processes, but I didn't get into my field to study made-up choices. I want to study real-world choices, choices that matter, choices that have existential weight. Let me give you an example. This is a choice from our data set of about 100,000 real-world choices. It's not randomly selected. I filtered it to look for choices made by 37-year-old men. I'm 37. This was the first one that showed up. Now, luckily, I'm not facing this choice, but we know people who are. Wouldn't it be nice if we could use our theories to say something about how they're making those choices, to predict their choices, to understand those choices, to improve those choices? We've got lots of great theories, but we can't do that. The problem is not with the theory, the problem is with the representation. Just to give an example, theories of decision-making essentially describe how people make trade-offs between attributes. We know how people do this, but what we don't know are the attributes involved in everyday choices. What are the trade-offs that this person is considering? Okay, so to answer these questions, we need a radically different approach to studying behavior. We need to move beyond the lab, and so that's what I'll be talking about. The data that we're using is a Reddit data set, about 5 million posts on the advice subreddit. We also have a bunch of smaller subreddits. We've got Ask Men Advice, Ask Women Advice, Friendship Advice, Career Advice. In all of these data sets, as you can imagine, people go and they post about their life dilemmas, and other users give them feedback about how to make these choices. We also have a more controlled data set in which we asked 500 representative US participants to describe important life decisions. Okay, so this is our data. This is what it looks like. All of our observations are essentially multiple paragraphs of descriptions of important life problems. How do we code them? How do we extract structure from them in order to study everyday choice? Well, you guessed it, we use large language models. We've got about 5 million posts on Reddit. We give these to GPT, and what GPT does is it tells us whether or not the choice involves a 2 and 2 options. That is whether or not it is a clear binary choice. Okay, so that's going to whittle down our data set from about 5 million open-ended posts to only about 100,000 clear binary choices. Those are the ones that we're going to study. Then we take these binary choices, we give them back to GPT, and we ask it to extract the choice options in these choices. So what are the 2 options that the decision maker is considering? And then we give them back, Then we give these options back again to GPT, and we ask it to extract the costs and benefits for each of these options, the pros and cons, as described in the post itself. Not my PC. Oh, okay. Oh, you want me on the camera too? Thank you. Lovely. Okay, so that's our pipeline, and when we apply it to a data set, oh, this is the one that's low on battery. It's a clicker. And when we apply it to a post like this, what we get essentially from GPT are, well, option 1 is leave the family, and there's some benefits and there's some costs. Costs include, things like emotional impact on children, loss of support from family and friends who may view the poster negatively. These are all things that this person is talking about in this post. And then you've got some benefits and costs for the other option, that's continue to suffer for the sake of the kids. Okay, so these are useful, right? This is structure extracted from a big blurb of text. But how do we further refine this? How do we further get out quantitative information? So for this purpose, we collected a list of about 207 attributes, goals, motivations that psychologists have collected over the past 40 years, past 60 years even. They come from decision theory, consumer behavior, goals, values, moral foundations, basically everything that people may care about as they're making important life choices. So there are about 207 of them. And then we take these we take these costs and benefits, and using an embedding model that vectorizes sentences, we code each of these costs and benefits in terms of these 207 attributes, which essentially then allows us to take each choice option and tell us what are its benefits along these attributes and what are its costs along these attributes. Okay, this approach to vectorizing the reasons and costs and benefits in decision making, we've done that a lot in recent work, typically applied to participant-generated costs and benefits. In this case, we're applying it to GPT-extracted costs and benefits from an online post. Okay, so this is what our data looks like. So we've got a post, it's got two options, option 1 and option 2, and for each of these we have 207 costs and benefits. So that's about 828 values for each post, and we've got about 100,000 posts, so that gives us 100 million coded values, which you could never extract from a standard psychological paradigm. Okay, a couple of studies to explore this data set. First, it's a validation study to see how representative are these choice problems, are these posts of the kinds of choices that people report in a representative controlled survey. So for this, as I told you, we elicited life choices from a sample of 500 representative US participants, and we got a very high correlation in terms of the attributes that show up in Reddit and in our control study. There is one attribute that shows up on Reddit occasionally that doesn't show up at all in our so-called representative sample. Any guesses? Okay, it's sex. So which of these is more representative of human behavior? I leave that up to you. Okay, we have another study in which we ask GPT, in which we take the GPT summaries and we give them to human participants to judge whether or not they're accurate. They're judged to be accurate 91% of the time. And in study 3, we do the same thing with our attribute coding with SBERT, and that's judged to be accurate 98% of the time. So this tells us that our pipeline is accurately extracting the kind of information that is in these posts. Okay, that's our data set. What do we do with this data set? Well, first thing, we can cluster it. We can do something like a factor analysis, which is what most psychologists would do when given a matrix that looks like this. I used hierarchical clustering to essentially look at both sort of higher order categories and maybe more lower level categories of attributes that show up together. And you see a lot of things that you would expect. For example, social attributes are very important, and they show up in different ways. They might show up as social connection. They might show up as social desirability, right? So having friends versus being liked by others. And social attributes also show up in the context of morality, so doing the right thing to other people. Money shows up in two different ways. Money shows up both in a career dimension, so earning money, but also in a virtue, which is financial prudence, that is spending money in a rational manner. Going back to our friend who's considering divorce, when we take our pipeline and apply it to this piece of text, we get essentially along our 30 or so mid-level attribute clusters, we get the following structure, right? So if he stays, that's high on family closeness and security, that's the one on the right. But if he leaves, high on happiness and pleasure, high on sex and romance, achievement, freedom and courage, and so on and so forth. And we have this kind of structure for every dilemma in our data set. Now, once we can quantify attribute structures at play in everyday decision making, we can do a lot of cool things. First, we can just understand what are the common trade-offs that people face in life. All right, what are they choosing between? Second, we can see how these trade-offs vary as a function of social context, like who they're with, what the other people that the choice involves. And likewise, we can also do that with temporal context, when they're making the choice, weekend versus weekday, for example. This all gives us the ecological structure of decision making. Of course, quantifying attributes also has other benefits. We can use our quantitative attribute structures to predict preferences. We can feed them into existing theories of decision making, and by doing so, port them to these real-world decision problems. Oh, it was the computer's battery. This is not my computer. This is like the standard computer here, so someone who knows this should come in and resolve this issue. Oh, sorry. Okay.
and it doesn't look professional.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
It looks weird on the camera.
Okay, while this gets sorted, let's just talk about attribute trade-offs, which which is really, I think, for me, the most interesting part of the analysis. Any idea what the most common type of trade-off is in our data set? I think many of us are facing this kind of trade-off right now, being here at a work event over the weekend, away from our families. Okay. Yeah, so I would say, well, the biggest trade-off, I would describe it as a trade-off between material success and interpersonal sources of meaning. The prototypical choice dilemma on Reddit, so if you take all our dilemmas and you put them on a multidimensional map, the one that is right in the center, the one that is essentially the blend of all the costs and benefits that everyone else faces, it's this woman. She's 27 years old. Her user ID is putrid marketing for some reason. That's the default it's a default Reddit username generation algorithm. So putrid marketing. She's 27 years old. She's got this opportunity to apply to a new job. It offers much more money, irregular schedule, and she has a 1-year-old daughter. Okay, so she asks her fiance. He said that she should go for it. She doesn't really trust him. She asks her friends. They say, someone say go for it. Someone say, don't. Some of them even say that a woman has a special role in the life of her child, and that annoys her, but she can't do anything about it. And so, with no one else to ask in the real world, she comes to Reddit and asks 1 million anonymous and indifferent strangers for advice on what's going to be probably one of the most important decisions in her life. Okay? Her post gets 0 engagement, 0 likes, 0 upvotes, and is automatically archived after 6 months. This is the prototypical choice dilemma, and I think it really captures what many of us face in our lives. It's worth noting that this kind of dilemma is not just common on Reddit, it's a staple of fiction. All right, so Walter White from Breaking Bad, Willy Loman from Death of a Salesman, these are all protagonists who, if they summarized their posts in 2 paragraphs and posted them onto Reddit, would find themselves co-located with putrid on our map. Okay, and not just putrid, but maybe also some of us. It's restarting. Okay. I'll just keep freestyling. I cannot not move on. Okay. Okay. So money and finance, these material sources of meaning, right? Really important. And it turns out that these trade off against all the other attributes. In fact, there are very few that they don't trade off against: profession, discipline, and ambition, or some that material success doesn't trade off against. But material success trades off against not just interpersonal sources of meaning, but self-fulfillment. It trades off against aesthetics. It trades off against pleasure. I had a little image for these characters. Okay, it trades off against so many different attributes. And I found that really interesting. Aristotle, in perhaps the first theory of economic psychology, said he cautioned against the pursuit of money. Why? Because money could stop being a means to an end. It could quickly become an end in itself. People would choose money over everything else. They would, that's not fair. Well, because there are many non-material sources of achievement too. And I wonder whether some of that is true over here as well. Aristotle's theories were the basis of the Catholic Church's teachings about money too. Okay, so we can study attribute trade-offs. We can also study social and temporal context. I'm going to give you just a snapshot, just one result, because we've got a lot of data in the paper. So here are the attributes that are more and less common in March 2020 versus March 2019. So let's just look at the ones that are more common in March 2020. You see physical health, cleanliness and control, family closeness, but also mental health, risk and stability, harm and group morality, right? This really allows you to understand how COVID changed the choices that we were facing. You can do this kind of analysis for lots of things. As I said, weekday versus weekend. You can do it for group composition, male, solo people versus dyads of different gender compositions. They all have different types of choices that this approach allows us to quantify and analyze. Okay, we can also predict preferences. So for this, we ran some new studies, pre-registered. All the studies in this paper were pre-registered. And what our participants did was we got online participants and we gave them dilemmas from Reddit, and we asked them to evaluate them, like what would they choose if they were facing these dilemmas. And we wanted to try and predict their choices in these naturalistic settings. I'll skip over the technical details, but we really had two main models. One was what I call a multi-attribute utility model. For those of you in the decision world, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's a very standard model of decision making that takes into account the attribute trade-offs, puts weights on them, and makes a decision. And that model actually does a pretty decent job at predicting people's preferences over these real-life decision scenarios. We're getting about an R-square of 0.15. That's around a correlation of 0.4. You can contrast that with a model that uses just demographics in order to predict people's choices, right? So who they are. And that model doesn't do well at all. So again, we're not predicting everything perfectly, but we are able to far surpass other predictive variables like demographics. Last thing we can do is understand underlying decision processes. How do people reason through these important life dilemmas? This is work that's still in progress in response to some reviewer comments. And since I'm running low on time, I will also skip over it. Okay, so I showed you this pipeline for extracting structure from these unstructured posts about important life dilemmas. It gives us a very rich data set with which to study real-life human choices. And with that, we can do lots of things, primarily understand the ecological structure of choice, but also use it to predict choice. Now, in the last minute or so, I want to tell you a little bit about how this approach fits into my broader research program. I've been working with LLMs since before they were large, since when they were just LM. You're laughing, thank you, but that's actually Lyle Unger's quote. I was very sad to see him here because I was gonna use it without attribution, but now I can't. Okay, and the reason I got excited about language models and large language models 10, 12 years ago was because they give us a way of quantifying the representations at play in cognition and behavior. Okay, so I've showed you some representations for essentially reasons for and against important life choices, but the same approach can be applied across different domains of psychology. Okay, so here's some examples. I started with the study of heuristics. Many of you have heard of the representativeness heuristic. If you've read Thinking Fast and Slow, it's in there. Well, we use this heuristic to make many important judgments in our lives. So Linda, for example, is a bank teller, and then people might judge the probability that she's a feminist. With using language model embeddings, we can quantify representations for Linda or for feminists and start predicting the heuristics that people are going to be using in everyday judgment problems. We can do the same thing in more applied settings. In that management science paper that I've cited over there, I use embeddings to model representations for common risk sources like nuclear power, like vaccines. And then from that, we can predict people's risk perceptions. Same thing for health. In the psych science paper, we use this to model representations for thousands of food items and predict why, for example, people find granola to be healthier than ice cream, even though they often have similar nutrition profiles. Taking a more cognitive perspective, all right? People have representations for thousands, for millions of concepts, for events, for people, places, and things in their minds. How are these representations retrieved? We can take established memory models in psychology and apply them at a naturalistic, high-scale level by essentially quantifying those representations with language models. And once we quantify those representations, we can model how they're used in the service of reasoning, how people manipulate these representations to form beliefs and hypotheses. In this in-press psychological review paper, I basically show that GPT, although it can reason, it doesn't reason in a human-like manner. But what you can do is take its representations, combine them with an established model of human reasoning, and suddenly you can predict human reasoning and human reasoning fallacies as well. Social cognition. We have representations for other people. These are the basis of prejudices, biases. Well, if you can represent how people represent others, then you can model these biases. In that PNAS paper, we're essentially predicting implicit biases for arbitrary concepts based on embedding representations for those concepts. The last application, very quickly, is in psychometrics. So most of psychometric analysis uses surveys, which are essentially linguistic, that have linguistic items, so basically sentences. Well, sentences can be quantified as well. So this opens up a radically new way of doing psychometrics. Instead of just looking at item-item correlation across participants, you can build a model that explains how people weigh different dimensions of a survey item's meaning in order to give a rating response. Okay, so these are just a snapshot of ways that I've used these kinds of models, and many other people, including people in this room, have done similar things. I find this to be the most promising way of using language models for the purpose of psychology theory. Okay, language models are not just simplistic replacements for human participants. They give us quantitative structure that we can combine with established models, and by doing so, scale them up to the real world to not just predict, but also understand real-world cognition. And I think this is a really exciting time to be doing this kind of work. Thank you.
And my talk, I don't know if this is an academic talk. If I had to characterize it in academic terms, this would be a narrative meta review. But really, it's going to be a story, okay? And it's a story about approaching the theoretical upper limit. And I know what you're thinking about, theoretical upper limit. What kind of story? A romance, of course. Okay, and this is going to be a romance between language-based assessments. What are language-based assessments? These are these models that take people's language and assess, give a score for a psychological trait or state. Over the years of data science and whatnot, they've gone by many aliases. AI-based psychological assessments, digital phenotypes, digital footprints, NLP models of traits, and more recently, using large language models for assessment, or, as we say in computer science, the very clear using LLMs for zero-shot or few-shot prediction of psychological scores. But this is the general idea of it, all right? That's one character in this relationship. And the other one is standard scales. Standard scales would be things like self-report questionnaires, structured interviews, rating scales, and the diagnoses to some extent insofar as they are often done based on standard scales. There's a whole other pool of issues with using diagnoses, but we're gonna throw them in there and save the issues with them for another talk. Importantly, what it's not is annotated scores, how we traditionally did things in AI, natural language processing, just saying a perception of this text looks like it's an extrovert's text. It's not that. It's not just sentiment analysis, which kind of fits the bill there. The point is, these are scales that are trusted. These are measures that are trusted in psychology. And it's been a bit of a rocky romance. And that's because, the language, why language has been quite interested in the scales, probably more so than the scale is in language, because it's been the standard. Scales have been the standard for assessing psychological traits and states. You could say maybe even these language-based assessments were overly infatuated with trying to match them. How can we go? How can we use AI or data science statistics, similar, whatever the term is at the moment, and get to a score from these scales, okay? So, and this relationship has, of course, like most relationships or romances, there are other characters in this. The first character is the healthy skeptic. This is a friend to both language and the standard scale. The second character is the reliability zealot. This is the friend to the standard scale, maybe too good of a friend. And then there's the Swedes. You may wonder, is it significant that they're Swedish? At this point, only insofar as this is an international romance. Okay, that's all you need to know at this point. All right, so the healthy skeptic. We started this work about 10 plus years ago with some of the colleagues that are in the room, and I want to say it was kind of the honeymoon phase when we started this work. There was lots of folks predicting mental health scores, well-being scores, personality scores from social media. And this is kind of when the data science took flight. Some people characterize this time as the Wild West. Lots of papers coming out predicting mental health, other sorts of the dark triad, life satisfaction. I was actually excited. This is a slide that I put together 5 years ago that I got to pull back out because I haven't done an overview of this stuff this stuff in a while. Just across lots of different places. As a prototypical example, with some of my favorite colleagues that are here today, we did this study. This was maybe the late phase of the honeymoon, where we studied language in Facebook as compared to depression in the medical records, led by Johannes Eichstadt. Okay, and this is just to give you an idea of how these studies typically worked. We'd extract patients' language encoding. Okay, this would be actually many times similar to what Sudeep just presented, as could be a latent space encoding. Here we have topics and how often they're being used by a patient. And then we're going to use machine learning techniques to try to predict diagnosis. And what we found, compared to a standard screening survey, on average, we could do a bit better on average at attaching to accuracy at detecting a diagnosis from language 2 years prior to the diagnosis. And then what's nice about language, continuing some of Sudeep's points, is you can look at it too. And these are, for example, 5 topics that came out as most highly predictive of having a diagnosis score. And you have things in here like low mood, crying, loneliness, psychosomatic symptoms like being sick, and then irritability. These are actually symptoms that are in the DSM. We didn't tell our model to look for DSM symptoms. It was able to pull it out. All right, so it's kind of exciting. But here's the thing at this point. Across dozens of data sets, lots of trait constructs. Okay, my pseudo meta review R from experience is that it would range from 0.2 to 0.5 correlation with standard scales. Okay? And I'm sticking with correlation here. I just showed you a rock curve. In computer science, we like classification, but I'm sticking with correlation because really we want to be able to predict a continuous scale. In psychology, most of you have some background in that area. Many of these constructs are best understood as dimensional. We don't just want to say whether you're high or low in it. We want to give you a score. And it also gives us a way to kind of standardize across studies a little bit more consistently. So we're sticking with correlations, even though many of these studies we're doing AUCs. I'll also say when you're doing classification, it's easy to like make it look better than it really is. You know, some studies leave out the middle group, and then it becomes easy to predict the bottom group from the top group. There's times where that makes sense, but just putting that aside for a second. Okay, we're using correlation. Okay, and so the healthy skeptic was really a few people in our group that had a background in psychology and psychometrics and trait theory. First thing they noted is actually, that's not bad. If you're getting above 0.4, that's actually really high, according to the modal effect size for correlations of psychology with behaviors on a whole. And so that's good. And actually, we'd push this for a while. And you know, the idea that this skeptic brought in to our group, this idea of using modern measurement theory. And that's kind of where that sort of idea came from. The idea, unlike many things that we're used to in computer science, where there is an accepted ground truth, you have to kind of triangulate construct validity, measurement reliability. I'm not going to go into details there, but we brought this together with measurement with cross-validation. Okay, probably one of the biggest differences between how we do statistics and machine learning versus psychology and quantitative sciences is it really helps to always test out of sample. You train and build a model, and then you test it on a different set of data, because it's very easy to overfit, especially with our modern AI techniques. Okay, so bringing these together, just testing on the test data, just testing the model on data that it had not seen when it was trained. The healthy skeptic and friends helped us walk through, and we basically found, in the first paper we kind of got accepted in the true psychology community, JPSP. That might not be entirely true, but it was one of the first papers. We tested for a bunch of construct validity and reliability and got things that were close to what you get from traditional scales. Okay, but one thing that was interesting that happened then, that has stuck with me since then in the back of my mind until until recently was this one test of external criteria, right? External criteria is about not just we want to get at the true trait and state. We don't have one scale that's ground truth. Well, what matters in the end? Predicting people's behaviors, predicting how they're going to, interact in the real world. And one of our tests for this was we looked at how our language-based extroversion compared to the questionnaire at predicting the two external variables. One was satisfaction with life. Satisfaction with life was assessed from a questionnaire. So here on the top you have questionnaire, one questionnaire predicting another questionnaire, shared method variance. And well, language extroversion is in the right direction, but it's not as strong as questionnaire extroversion. On the other hand, this colleague was perplexed about this, was that when we predicted number of friends, this was not something assessed by a questionnaire. It's literally behavior. How many people are you friending on Facebook? And language extroversion predicted it better. And this is a little odd because actually language extroversion was fit to questionnaire extroversion. And it was like, how could this happen? I don't know. I think we had one late night talking about it, and then I kind of forgot about it for a long time. So then that brings us to the reliability zealot. Now, in the reliability zealot, a later point now, I'm meeting with the minds of folks that are really into standard scales, and I'll say most of them we're not zealots, and we're talking about how language-based assessments, to what extent they can replace or supplement questionnaires. And one of the arguments that's put forward was kind of a similar sort of argument that theoretically was put forward, was that, well, language correlates with questionnaires at 0.5, behavior correlates with questionnaires often at like 0.3, the behaviors you care about in the end. So if we're going to use language to replace these and the max you can get from your best models at the time is 0.5, then what does that mean? What does that mean then that language should correlate with the behavior? Yeah, you might think, and I wouldn't say all of them, but one person put forward, well, you should do 0.5 times 0.3 and get 0.15. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go into an overly technical talk, but this is not true. Right? The correlations are not like probabilities, independent probabilities that you can just multiply when you can assume they're independent and get a new probability. In fact, it is possible for a language-based assessment that only correlates with the questionnaire at 0.5 to end up predicting better. And you saw one evidence of this in Jonas's talk earlier at the county level. Okay, we've seen it at other levels. Why does, I'm going to talk about that in a second. But then after, so I brought up, well, this isn't really correct, and like then the conversation turned to true, but they brought out this, they brought out this thing I never expected. They brought out the trump card, I guess, and said, well, still, nobody's going to accept your scale, your language-based assessments, until you meet alternate form reliability. We have this thing called alternate form reliability. Does anyone know that type of reliability? Alternate form reliability is where you take two versions of a questionnaire that measures the same thing and you correlate them. Of course, they correlate super highly. If you ask people to answer questions like, do you feel blue today? And do you feel sad today? They tend to answer the questions very similar. In fact, in some of these, they have the same questions as part of them. But anyways, the point was put out that we should be doing as well as reliability. I kind of left this protesting, questionnaires are only a proxy for true psychological traits and states. And in fact, many of the people in this meeting room were like, you shouldn't care about matching that, but it's still stuck in my mind. There's the dissenters, the reviewer too, that always kind of like brings up that point. Why aren't you correlating as well as reliability? Left that to the side, moved on to for a bit and moved on to this idea of, well, let's focus on what we care about, the external validity in the end. Language should tell us more. This is a more recent study we did just showing how language actually has so much more information in it than what you get from rating scales. It kind of makes sense when you think about it from this point. We don't talk to each other just through random numbers on a Likert scale. There's much more information we can convey in words. Okay? Has more range, has dimensionality, has both of them together. Here's kind of a depiction of a standard scale. Might give you this many if it was 2 dimensions, like positive affect and negative affect. And language would give you even more dimensions and more points within those dimensions that you could get at. And so there's actually, though, information theory that tells you how to assess this. It's the theory that led to the bit. It basically says what is the theoretical minimum amount of bits you would need to store your data. And so we took a data set of people that took rating scales and shared language about their affect, and we found that, well, it only took 43 bits minimum to store their positive affect, 34 for negative, put them both together, 77 bits to store all their information on positive negative affect, and just the same sort of question in natural language, how are you feeling? 367, just tons more information. It shouldn't be that surprising, but I think the point had not been made before. Okay. And so where have we seen this external criteria play out? One of my favorite examples is trying to apply these techniques for risk assessment and entering an addiction treatment facility and trying to assess whether patients will be in 90 days or not. And in this case, we could compare to a structured clinical interview, the Addiction Severity Index. And what we found is this digital phenotype language-based assessment was significantly more predictive than what you'd get from the Addiction Severity Index. Of course, you could put them together and do even better. To kind of understand what this is doing, these are kind of survival curves across time of staying in treatment or not. This group up here is those that the model said were the least likely to drop out, and most of them, 90%, were stayed in. And down here are those most predicted to drop out, and most of them did drop out. This was only using data from before they entered treatment. Another example, looking across time, I think is one of the greatest places we should be focusing on with these types of assessments to say what's going to happen in the future. Another colleague looked at AI models assessing anxiety and depression and how they changed prior to entering a hospital facility and found more anxious and depressive language. And looking at predicting now into the future of symptom trajectories, not just will you stay in treatment or not, but across a variety of symptoms in a World Trade Center responder clinic, which treats a high proportion of people that were patients were responders and have post-traumatic stress disorder. And using these AI models, actually completely out of sample here, it wasn't even trained on this data, and we compared it to how well you could predict using the symptom questionnaire at the time of the interviews, also controlling for age, gender, occupation, days since the event, and we found our anxiety-based model was predicted the symptom trajectory significantly. Okay. Still, this was in the back of my mind. All right, so that brings me, going a little slower, that finally brings me to the sweets. Okay? That was in the back of my mind, wasn't thinking much about it. I started this collaboration with this group in Sweden, actually to do similar stuff that Sudeep has pioneered, where they had been using latent semantic analysis to look at similarity between texts and to try to do some cool stuff there. And I was coming to try to update them and have them use contextual embeddings, which is the early word for large language models. Before they were as large as they are now. They were called large language models back then, but they really weren't large yet. They were just larger than what we had before that. Okay. But something happened. We started this collaboration, and they showed me this data set that we were going to use for the collaboration, and said they had a 0.7 correlation when they just used their LSA-based measure, which is basically like, counting the words that people are using with the questionnaire. I was like, this is suspect. Now the Swedes are now suspect. I don't know if I believe this. So they shared the data set with me, and because we were going to start to use it to do these similarity studies, and I ran it through our toolkit that we had developed at that point over many years to do these sorts of assessments. And in fact, the correlation was even better after that, mostly due to small tweaks in how you tokenize and little tricks of the trade. This was surprising me. They weren't even making a big deal about it. And this is where the other significance of them being Swedish maybe comes into play. There's a word in Swedish, lagom. Does anyone know it? Means just enough. Means just enough. Well, there's a lot of debate on exactly how to translate it to English. Some say there's not exact translation, but just enough. You don't need, you don't need to be basically fighting to be the best. They were just trying to do cool stuff. Still, we couldn't help ourselves, and we had to take back up the reliability zealot and say, okay, this is what we were getting beforehand. R equals 0.4 to R equals 0.5 of the correlation between language and the standard scales, mostly using social media type stuff. And then if you look at the reliability, this is now more reasonable reliability, like internal reliability, test-retest reliability, stuff like that. You get 0.65 to 0.85 correlations. And so the question was, if we, I kind of skipped over this briefly, but if we use their approach, what we figured out was that they had two things they were doing that was in common with this setup. They kept the domain the same. They were prompting for language that was about what the questionnaire was about, depression, life satisfaction, okay? And they asked it at the same point in time. All of these, we were studying people from way before questionnaires were administered most of the time. Now, the only difference was the format. And then finally, we added in the transformer because this gives us our best representation of language, the most powerful representation of language. And we said, well, we want to see if we can hit this reliability upper limit. And what we found was we could. Depending on the setup, we could get all the way up to 0.85 correlation, which is something I thought actually would never be possible. There's the papers up there about it. These are the Swedish colleagues. They're more than just their nationality, I should now mention. And they came up. They had this approach and bringing the stuff together. By the way, Oscar is the developer of the text package in R that lets you do stuff like this in R if you want to use transformers and language models for your language-based assessments. And so that brought us, I think, to, is that right? I feel like you gave me, okay. That brought us to convergence, in my opinion, between the two and to a world where now we're in a post-convergence, that should say world, but word works as well. And, you could say, well, what about the other domains and timing? And we can study that sort of stuff, I think. But I hope it actually just gives more push that we should focus towards understanding the true psychological trait and state, on external validity, on leveraging these AI models to give us the most powerful, I believe, representation of people. And then it doesn't even have to be just based on their language, based on speech, based on facial expressions now we can use. Here's an example of a study we've been pushing in this direction from a PhD student on the market this year, by the way, Vasudha Darajan, that used adaptive we created this method, adaptive language-based item response theory, that adapted item response theory to use language-based responses and to be able to get to this true score as quickly as possible in a conversation. And I should also say we're applying ideas from psychology back to AI as well, trying to improve the AI models using ideas from psychology. That's kind of an example that's going in both directions. These are just a smidgen of collaborators that were involved in a lot of these. Those in green were students in the lab and key collaborators from psychology and psychiatry and health. And thank you for your attention. Should also mention we're recruiting.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for inviting me to speak. I'm so excited to share some of my recent work with you all. My name is Paul Stillman. I just started at Questrum here at Boston University in July. And to start, I want to start with a choice that you're all going to have to make tonight, which is whether or not to drink at the reception. And this is a classic example of a self-control conflict because it pits immediate gratification in the form of some tasty beverages with colleagues against our longer-term, higher-order goals of things like budget, productivity, and being, kind of with it the next day at the conference. And these are the sorts of choices that people face on a near-daily basis, and how they decide within these self-control conflicts has major implications for their long-term subjective well-being. And because of that, there's been this huge interdisciplinary research program trying to understand how we can help people resist versus indulge in temptation. And I think this is a super important, line of research. But today I'm going to ask a slightly different question, which is, how do people succeed at self-control? By which I mean, what are the temporal dynamics at play as people are navigating the conflict between immediate and delayed gratification? And in particular, a lot of the research has sort of focused on this choice, resist versus indulge. And obviously this is a really important choice, but this is the end point of the entire decision process. And by just focusing on the choice, what I'm going to propose today is that we leave a lot of information out that we could be capitalizing on. So let me sort of illustrate what I mean with a sports analogy. So of course we're going to use the Buffalo Bills. Go Bills. I am a Bills fan. I really care if the Bills won versus lost their game. That is the most important top-line result for me. But I don't just care if they won or lost. I want to know what that victory or defeat means. Is it diagnostic of how good they are this season? Is it predictive of their future performance? How much of my money should I be betting on them to make the Super Bowl? And similarly, if I'm somebody who's tasked with improving the team, like a GM or a coach, I can't just know whether they won or lost. I need to know how they won or lost. Was the defense good? Was the offense bad? These are the sorts of questions that you can't get just by looking at the outcome. To get at these, you have to watch the tape. You have to watch the game itself. And what I'm going to argue in today's talk is that we can think of decisions in much the same way, and I'm going to use a technique known as mouse tracking to hopefully convince you all that this can be kind of like the tape of a decision. And we're going to use this to investigate two questions with self-control. First, can we better predict preferences and future behavior using motor conflict on choices? And then can we use this sort of real-time metric of choice to shed new light onto old questions in self-control? And I'll get more into that in the second half of the talk. So just to introduce this technique, this is not something that I invented. This was developed by cognitive psychologists, built off the back of these models that says that our motor movements are continuously updated to reflect ongoing cognitive processing. So for instance, in one early study, these researchers had participants categorizing animals as either mammals or fish. And what they found is that their mouse movements were more directed for typical exemplars like cows compared to atypical exemplars such as whales. And a lot of my research has been trying to port these techniques into the domain of decision making to show that we can use mouse tracking as a dynamic, real-time measure of decision-making and the evolution and resolution of conflict. And so what I'm going to try to show to you today is first show you some data trying to validate this as a useful metric of decision-making, and then use this metric to try to answer sort of theoretical questions about the nature of self-control. Okay, so I'm going to present all of my studies at once because they're all very similar. We give participants roughly 200 intertemporal choices. These are choices of a smaller amount of money available immediately, the smaller sooner, versus a larger amount available at a delay. And these are used quite often by self-control researchers because it kind of distills the self-control conflict into that immediate versus delayed gratification. Across our studies, we have over 500 participants, and in studies 2 and 3, we incentivize them with real money. So they're making 200 of these choices, and while they're doing this, we're measuring their mouse movements. So this is what it looks like on a given trial. You press a start button on the bottom center of the screen, the choices appear, and you move your mouse to make a choice. And this is a slowed down trajectory of somebody's actual choice. And all the while, we're measuring their mouse movements several hundred times per second to give us this really data-rich window into their decision. And there's a lot of different ways to analyze it, and I'm going to talk about 2 today. The first that I'll talk is this sort of like classic way of analyzing these data. It's called area under the curve. And the way that we do this is we just compare participants' actual trajectory to a straight trajectory and take the area between those 2 lines. And the idea here is if this is sort of an easy choice for participants, they'll just sort of beeline to the larger later. But if this is hard, their mouse is going to be attracted to this opposite option. I'll also just mention that across our studies, we have close to 100,000 choices, roughly half of which are choices of larger later. So the first thing that I want to show to you is that this area under the curve metric really nicely taps into the conflict that participants are experiencing on a given trial. So to that end, what we're going to do, to sort of validate this measure, what we're going to do is we're going to take, for each participant, we're going to take all of their choices. First, we're setting aside the mouse movements for now. We're going to take all their choices and use that to calculate their discount rate, their hyperbolic discount rate, which is their tendency to discount rewards in the future. And what we can then do is that we can take that discount rate and use it to calculate the subjective value of the larger later option. So for instance, the median discount rate in our studies is 0.023. For someone with a discount rate of 0.023, $20 in 90 days is equal to $7.14 today. And then we can compare that to the smaller, sooner amount, $5. And what we're going to do is we're going to use how similar these 2 are in subjective value space to predict how much conflict participants are showing via this area under the curve. The idea being that if these are very similar in subjective value space, that should be a really conflicting decision. We should see not very direct paths. But if one option is really dominating the other in subjective value space, we would expect their mouse to sort of be beelining to that option. Okay, so let me show you here what I've done is I've recoded choices so that everything's ending on the right, and I've binned them according to their difference in subjective value. So in red here, this is the average of every single trial for whom the subjective values are really close together, the most similar in subjective value. And as you can see, this is not a very direct path. And as we go down the color spectrum, one option is going to dominate the other more and more in subjective value space. And what you see when you look at this is we get this really nice rainbow such that it's not just that mouse movements are able to distinguish, easy versus hard trials, but we actually get quite a nice gradation such that our mouse movements are really reflective of the difference in subjective value. And so what we could do, and I won't go into it today for time considerations, but what we can do is sort of flip these analyses on their head and say, hey, we can use these mouse trajectories as sort of diagnostic windows into people's underlying preferences. And so in some other studies we've done, we've shown that motor conflict on these decisions is predictive of subsequent choices. So for instance, your conflict when choosing healthy over unhealthy is predictive of your actual subsequent choice between an apple and a candy bar. How conflicted you are when you're saying you like or dislike racial in-group or out-group members is predictive of subsequent prosocial behavior towards racial in-group or out-group members. And lastly, with risk preferences, we've shown that when the conflict when weighing to take or pass on risk strongly predicts prospect theory parameters of loss aversion, diminishing marginal utility, and also predicts subsequent choices. Okay, so hopefully this is just at least enough to sort of validate that these motor movements really meaningfully reflect the choice context and are sort of indicative of the conflict participants are experiencing on these choices. So the next thing I'm going to turn to is trying to, this question that I started with of how do people succeed at self-control? How do these choices of long-term over short-term evolve over time? And this might sound like a little bit of a sort of technical inside baseball question, but I think that this question actually is strongly related to sort of core questions of what self-control is. So let me expand on this. A lot of our theories in psychology either implicitly or explicitly make predictions about the time course of these choices. So probably the best example is dual systems theories make very stylized predictions about how self-control is evolving with system 1 being active early and system 2 being active relatively later. And this has been sort of the either explicitly or implicitly sort of the bedrock assumption behind lots of self-control research that really emphasizes impulse inhibition. So impulse inhibition is this idea that the reason that we fail at self-control is because we get these automatic impulses to indulge that we don't then inhibit. So self-control success arises because we're able to inhibit these sort of system 1 impulses with our system 2 slower processes. And so these types of models might predict a sequential evolution of self-control, where you first start beelining to the indulgent option before you correct back to the larger later option in this sequence. And impulse inhibition models are extremely generative and have been really, really important in self-control, but there's been sort of a rising backlash against them. So for instance, work showing that a lot of our automatic processes support goal pursuit rather than just, they're not the same as it's not always that automatic corresponds to compelling you to indulge. There are also models like the drift diffusion model that have been really generative recently that don't give any sort of temporal precedence or preference for impulse over temptation over goals. So these models, which I'm going to refer to as dynamic competition models, say it's sort of just a dynamic push-pull or tug-of-war from the beginning rather than this sort of two-staged evolution. And though it could still be very conflicting, what it suggests is that the conflict will evolve in this more graded manner. And hopefully from these slides, it's sort of obvious that mouse tracking is an ideal tool to adjudicate between these two models. So what we're going to do is we're going to take all of our choices, 47,000. We're just, for the second part of the talk, we're just going to be looking at these 47,000 trajectories where people chose the larger later over the smaller sooner. And this is basically a classification problem. We want to see, do they generally look more like the thing on the left, or do these choices of long-term over short-term look more like the thing on the right? But there's a problem with this. And the problem is this is what they actually look like. I call this my trajectory tornado. There's a huge amount of heterogeneity in the data. And so what we want to do rather than, I'm glossing over some past research that's tried to do very blunt ways of doing this, we want a data-driven approach to reveal the latent structure of these trajectories rather than us say, hey, it's either this or this, because it could be something else entirely. So this isn't something that existed, and so it's something we had to develop. And I'll just go over this sort of at a high level. We use a hierarchical clustering technique. So the way this works is we take all 47,000 trajectories or choices of long-term over short-term. We calculate the similarity between each trajectory. We use hierarchical clustering to organize these trajectories according to similarity, and then that outputs the taxonomic structure. And I imagine many of you are familiar with how this works, but just to illustrate this in a domain you're all very familiar with, this is just the same approach that you would take for developing a species taxonomy. So, here at the top of these hierarchies is for these animals is the difference between animals and plants, and then you can further subdivide the animal kingdom into birds and mammals, canines and felines, and so on. So that's exactly what we're going to do, except instead of 9 organisms, we got 40,000 choices. So obviously this is a fair bit more complex. So to try to interrogate these data, the first thing that we're going to do is look at that very top of the tree. So in our data, what's the difference between plants and animals? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you basically the average of all of the trajectories in black and all of the trajectories in brown. And here's what you see. And what you see is 2 trajectories that look very similar to the couple slides ago, impulse inhibition on the left and dynamic competition on the right. And we were pretty excited about this, first off, because this is a data-driven approach. We didn't tell them, hey, here are the two models we're interested in. This is just the data revealing that to us. And it also suggests that this question that I posed a couple of slides ago of which is doing a better job of describing self-control might not actually be the right question, because we're seeing evidence for both of these. Though importantly, we are seeing impulse inhibition is roughly half as frequent as dynamic competition, which is notable given that impulse inhibition is kind of still the predominant model of self-control, especially in domains outside of psychology. Now, we've done a number of robustness checks. One I want to discuss very quickly, though, is you might be thinking, okay, maybe people are just using the dynamic competition approach for these easy choices and impulse inhibition for the hard choices, the real self-control choices. So to look at this, what I've done here on the x-axis, this is, again, that difference in subjective value on a given trial. So over on the left, these are these trials that have really similar subjective values, and on the right are those where one option is really dominating. If we're just using dynamic competition for the easy trials and impulse inhibition for the hard trials, we would expect the distributions of these to be disjoint. But in fact, what we see is that they're incredibly overlapping. So what this means is that people are using both impulse inhibition and dynamic competition for across the sort of difficulty of these choices. Okay, so just to summarize quickly what we've got so far, our predominant models suggest one of these, either impulse inhibition or dynamic competition, and we're seeing evidence for both of these. Though, importantly, we see less impulse inhibition is less frequent than dynamic competition. But I think one of the really exciting parts of this approach is we don't have to stop here. So this is where some of the self-control debates has been thus far, but we don't have to stop here. In fact, we can go deeper and look at heterogeneity within impulse inhibition and within dynamic competition, by which I mean we can look at sort of the different ways that these operate, the different subdivisions of these. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 4 different subdivisions for impulse inhibition and dynamic competition. And so I'm running out of time, so I'll try to go through this a little quickly. But if you break down the impulse inhibition, you can sort of see these things vary quite systematically. Another way that you can look at this is a function of time. So here, the x-axis is location in the x space, but now the y-axis is time. So 0 is the beginning of the trial and 100 is the end of the trial. And you can see that these impulses are sort of varying on a number of dimensions, such as like how big the impulse is and when in the trial it occurs. And we can do the same thing with the dynamic competition trajectories. These actually look all pretty similar if you look at them like this form, but when you look at them as a function of time, you can see that they really vary on when they are deflecting over to their ultimate choice. And I think this is the sort of thing that this is the closest I've ever gotten to what I sort of promised at the beginning of being able to see the plays and watch the tape of these choices. And the last thing that I want to discuss is you might be thinking like, okay, is this actually meaningful? Maybe this is all just sort of like random fluctuations in mouse movements. And so what I'm going to try to do is convince you that this is actually meaningful variation, and by taking advantage of it, we get a lot of predictive leverage. So what we do to try to validate the importance of these is we first split our data set in half, and our first half of choices are going to be our training set. And then what we're going to do is for each participant, we're going to try to predict their choices. So how many larger later versus smaller sooner choices were they making? And we're going to construct 4 different models with different pieces of information and then compare those models. So in one model, we're going to give mean reaction time, which is sort of a classic process tracing metric. So this says, on average, how long did it take people to take larger later over smaller sooner? The second model, we give it information about that area under the curve metric that I discussed at the beginning of the talk. The third model, we give it information about the relative reliance on impulse inhibition versus dynamic competition. And in the last model, we give the model information about the relative reliance of each of the specific subtypes of impulse inhibition and dynamic competition. So we train these models and then we test it using out-of-sample data on our second half of choices, and we just look at what the R squared is for each of these models. So reaction time, mean reaction time, does predict, this is sort of meaningful information, but once we start using these mouse metrics, that jumps up to 0.23. And then going from area under the curve to the specific ways in which people were arriving at these choices gives us even further predictive leverage. And now, if going even deeper didn't really give you that much, we would expect this to be roughly equivalent to this last model to be roughly equivalent to the impulse inhibition model. But in fact, we see that when we give it information about all the different ways of arriving at self-control success, the models do even better. And these are some of the sort of most striking R squareds I've gotten in my career. So, so just to summarize, mouse tracking can sensitively detect conflict and gives us predictive leverage for inferring preferences. We see evidence for both impulse inhibition and dynamic competition. All right, well, we see oh, you know what I might have done? Did I do? All right, well, I'll just, there's only like one more slide, one more pretty picture. We see evidence for both impulse inhibition and dynamic competition, though importantly, it seems like impulse inhibition is in the minority. But also, if we go beyond just this sort of, which model is right versus wrong, and actually start to investigate the rich diversity of self-control, the many diverse routes to self-control success, we get quite a lot more information than just looking at staying sort of at this top gross level. All right, thank you all so much. Excited for your questions. So the question is on individual differences and variability or consistency within and across people. And this is something that we've looked at a lot. There is there's both consistency and variability. So it's not like one person is using, cluster number 4 over and over and over, but they do tend to, you see when you like plot the relative reliance, it'll be like one participant will have like a third of their trajectories in one, and then like, 10 to 5% in the others. So we do, and another thing that we look at is sort of what predicts people's reliance on impulse inhibition versus dynamic competition. And one of the things that we find is that people with worse self-control are more reliant on impulse inhibition, which sort of suggests that, what we should be trying to do is trying to reduce the impulses that people are getting rather than equipping people with the tools to inhibit those impulses, at least in general. Yeah, thank you. All right, I'll now sit down and join yeah, it sounds like we have 2 minutes for questions for any of us.
Yeah. So good question. I think for people describing important life decisions and eliciting advice, Reddit is probably unique. Maybe Twitter, Facebook. I'm sure people do that, but it's kind of not within it's not always coded within, let's say, a hashtag or whereas in Reddit it's all within that community. But I would say that the broader goal of extracting structure about the experiences of people can be accomplished not just with Reddit data, but with all types of media data as well as standard lab data. So I believe some people in this group have been involved in collecting the HappyDB data set. This is sort of a data set of 100,000 life experiences, 100,000 happy experiences. And I think, and what me and some others are doing is applying a very similar pipeline to extract the underlying structure of those experiences in order to understand what it is that makes a moment happy. So if you understand, if you like choice, then maybe Reddit is the best you have. But there's so many other psychological dimensions that can be extracted using so many other different data sets.
I really enjoyed the pairing of the first 2 talks. That was a real treat. And so I'm curious, just kind of given this like idea that you're hitting this like maximum threshold. If you're starting, if you could talk a little bit more about like where you're going in terms of methodological innovations next. So you sort of just like briefly mentioned this like idea of adaptive surveys. I think something I've been really interested in is just, as we move from like language-based assessments on digital trace data, which is getting harder to get and has always been biased, moving to open-ended surveys or language-based assessments of like journaling or diary tasks. And so I'm just curious kind of for both of you as you've been working in this space, what you're excited about and what you want to caution people about moving forward.
Sure. I'll go first. I'm excited about, to elaborate on the technique of, doing adaptive testing. I think, this idea where we're hitting this maximum, this theoretical maximum when they're being prompted to write about the same, I kind of was rushing at this point, write about the same thing that the questionnaire is asking about. And I think one of the big advantages of these types of assessments is that a single response or a single set of responses, a person's language data, can end up predicting multiple outcomes. I think that's one of the exciting directions, and even for the adaptive approach, is to be able to get a full psychological profile. Imagine a clinical intake that spans multiple types of internal, externalizing disorders, or does personality at once. And I think, I guess I'd also caution that I don't know that just because, I hope I hit on this, just because it matches the questionnaire, that doesn't mean it's what we want in the end. And we don't know that. I think there's some evidence that for these behaviors, the social media, the ecological data, might be more, in some situations, more valuable. The fact that it is unprompted. But it's just probably never going to reach that convergence with an imperfect questionnaire at the same level. So I'd also caution not to over-rely on prompting for the same construct you're trying to measure, because I think one of the big advantages here is to be able to measure multiple things at once from one set of language from somebody.
Yeah, I can add that, in psychology, I would say there are two main currents. One is assessment, and that's what I think Andrew focused on, which is how do you extract traits that maybe you can use to predict behaviors. And a second current involves understanding underlying mechanisms, underlying processes. That's actually what Paul was talking about. And LLMs are useful for both. So Andrew's talk was very much about the former. What draws me to LLMs is their potential for illuminating the latter, right? When you think about a survey item, it's not just sort of a measure of a trait. The response to that survey item, I am an extroverted person. I like making friends. I like talking on the stage. That response itself is generated by a complex set of cognitive mechanisms. And by quantifying that survey item, you can understand those cognitive mechanisms. So that's, for me, the most exciting direction.